This is the new for 2024 Moto Guzzi V100 Stelvio, a follow-on from the V100 Mandello Roadster that they launched last year. And I really enjoyed that bike when I rode it. So does this more adventure touring interpretation live up to expectations? Well, in this video, we'll go through the 15 key things that you need to know to find out. But before we get started, a massive thanks to REBELHORN for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. In all of the riding footage that I've used in this video, I'm wearing their CUBBY adventure suit, which is a really versatile piece of kit that's perfect for this time of year. In both the jacket and trousers, you've got a thermal lining to keep you nice and toasty on those cool days. But then also a waterproof membrane that can be worn either inside or outside the suit to make sure you stay dry if you do encounter some less than ideal weather. Then there's plenty of ventilation, which means you can open it up if you do get hot. And so really you've got so many different combinations that you can run with this suit that you should pretty much always be able to find a setup that meets the conditions. On top of that, it looks pretty fantastic. I've got to say it ties in quite nicely with the paint on this bike. And so I'd thoroughly recommend checking out the links down in the description below. And I think you might also be quite impressed with the price. So once again, a massive thanks to REBELHORN for their support. And with that, let's take a look at the bike. Now, I think the first thing you've got to acknowledge with the V100 Stelvio is the fact that it's a fantastic looking motorcycle. From nose to tail, there are loads of little details that I like, from this Mandello Eagle daytime running light, the shape and the finish on the tank, those little cutouts on the side panels, and also what I think is probably the best looking tail light on the entire motorcycle market. I think they've done a great job of taking the fundamentals of the Mandello and then just adapting it and blowing it up to make it look a bit more rugged and adventure-y. And I'll also say the way that the V-twin sticks out either side adds to the looks as well. Then you've got the shaft drive with the single-sided swing arm, you've got those tubeless spoke rims as well. And so yeah, I'd say a fantastic looking bike that really does balance that slightly utilitarian vibe, but also definitely still has a bit of Italian flair. As well as adding to the looks, though, I will say this new liquid cooled V-twin from Moto Guzzi really does dominate the riding experience as well. And I'm reluctant to use words like character and soul when it comes to a Moto Guzzi because I think it's, quite clearly overdone, but it really does have a lot of personality to it, and the more you ride the bike, the more you really start to enjoy it. It's got a fantastic sound to it, lots of bassy induction when you wind on the throttle. And there's just the right amount of vibes as well. I wouldn't say it's the smoothest engine, but they're not really invasive or annoying or uncomfortable. Then of course you've got that little sideways kick when you fire it up and when you give it a quick twist of the throttle, owing to the transverse orientation of this V-twin and the longitudinal crank. And so yeah, it's a really memorable motor that leaves an impression even after a relatively short time with the bike. I think the key thing is though, it really does perform quite nicely as well. If you've ever ridden one of the air-cooled Moto Guzzis like the V85 TT, also an adventure bike, you'll be familiar with the mid-range and torquiness that they can deliver, but naturally with them being air-cooled, there's a limit in terms of the sort of top end. This though is really quite happy to rev up, and there's quite a lot of rev range to explore. And actually, although 113 horsepower I think isn't a huge amount by today's standards, I certainly found it to be enough on the road. And even if you stick in second, you don't find yourself changing gears too much on a good curvy country road. You can rev it out between corners, use the full extent of the power, and there's not necessarily a lot of need to be constantly up and down the box. That said, there is an option of a quick shifter in the accessories catalogue. It's £187.99. And thankfully it's fitted to this press bike, so I did get a chance to test it out. Now it's extremely slick on the downshifts at almost any point in the rev range, and it's really sweet in the top end revs when you're on the upshift. And it's got this really nice sound to it as well when the engine's singing and you're banging through the gears with the quick shifter. The only thing I will say is it's not that good on the upshift in the lower revs. So if you're someone who likes to use a quick shifter, around town and stuff like that, there's just a bit of a firm jolt that feels quite uncomfortable and had me, using the clutch. It's kind of weird because it's so smooth on the downshift, even if you're going down from second to first at pretty much walking speed, it feels seamless. But I think otherwise it's really quite good, and most realistically, people are going to be using it more when they're riding quicker anyway. Now, one of the other things I really like about the riding experience with this bike in relation to the engine is the throttle delivery and how it really nicely balances aggression and sportiness, especially in the sport mode, but also being smooth and not choppy on and off the throttle. Now, there's a good selection of modes here. You've got sport, road, touring, rain, and off-road, and each of them's configurable through the dash. And I think there's a really nice distinction between the different throttle maps, with sport being super lively and probably the one you want to go for if you're getting a bit of a lick on. But then also it's nice to be able to dial it back a bit if you're looking for a more relaxed ride in modes like road and tour. Now, I think this bike can make a really nice adventure tourer. It's definitely more road biased than it is off-road. And it's got some practical stuff about it, which I think could come in handy. So one being the shaft drive. Of course, that's going to help minimize the amount of maintenance you're going to need to do. And in this sort of market, in the 900 and 1000cc adventure bikes, in that 14 to 15 grand kind of range, where you're looking at bikes like the Africa Twin and the Tiger 900 Rally Pro, for example, well, I don't think there are any other options that give you that shaft drive. So it could be viewed as a unique selling point. Then you've got a nice big 21 litre fuel tank, which should give you decent range between stops. And Moto Guzzi claim 5.1 litres per 100 kilometers travelled in terms of fuel consumption, which would give you over 400 kilometers or 250 miles. And while I didn't quite achieve those figures because I was riding it fairly assertively, I think if you were riding steady on the motorway, you should be able to get somewhere-ish near that. Now, another key factor in terms of distance work is, of course, good wind protection. And I really got on well with this bike. And I wasn't necessarily expecting that much because you got to say, it isn't the biggest windscreen on the market. It is electronically adjustable though. It's quite noisy when you've not got the engine running, but you don't really notice it out on the road. And I think that's a really nice bit of convenience. It blocks out most of the wind flow when it's up. I'm about 5'9" or 175 centimeters, and it really is comfortable for me. Not much buffeting at all, keeps it nice and quiet. But then also in the down position, I found I was getting decent wind flow from about the chest up, and that can really help to keep you that bit cooler if you do encounter a fairly hot day. I'd also say ergonomically I found it quite comfortable as well, and I noticed as soon as I got on it, this really high bar position that has your arms out nice and straight. Maybe someone had been riding this bike off-road or something before me because they were rotated a bit far forward, and I found myself perhaps having to reach a little too far forward to be entirely comfortable. But a quick bit of adjustment to pull them back for a more road-friendly position, and I reckon I could ride this bike happily all day. As for the seat, well, it feels quite firm when you first get on the bike, but in my experience, the firmness doesn't necessarily always translate to how comfortable it's going to be. I've had squishy seats that I found terrible, and this is the opposite. It feels a bit firm, but actually by the end of a decent day's riding, I had no complaints at all. It sits at 830 mil. I don't think it's adjustable, and so for me, I think that's in a nice spot for a road-focused adventure bike where it gives you some of that height and visibility over the traffic, but it's not so tall that it's got you really reaching down to the floor when you come to a stop. There are, however, a couple of options in the accessories catalogue, so if that's not your sort of seat height, then definitely have a quick look. And I think you've also got the option of a heated seat in there, as well as heated grips, which I think I'd almost certainly be speccing up on this bike. Now, as you can see, braking is really well spec'd on the Stelvio. You've got a pair of 4-piston radially mounted Brembo calipers on 320mm discs, and also a Brembo radial master cylinder up at the lever there, and there's a matching hydraulic clutch lever as well. Now, both of those are adjustable, so you can get it perfectly set up for your size of hand. But as for the performance, well, I was thinking actually the brakes felt a little bit soft at first. There's not that much aggression in the initial bite, but the more I rode it, I felt like it was actually really appropriate for this bike because there is a nice steady progression to it and then lots of power as you really begin to squeeze. So yeah, it might not feel that sporty initially, but I think if you want to ride smooth, if you've got a pillion or luggage, then realistically you're probably going to be grateful for that soft introduction to the travel of the lever. And it will also come in handy if you do want to take this bike doing some light off-roading where you might encounter, of course, looser surfaces. As for the handling more broadly on this bike, well, like I say, it is fairly road focused for an adventure bike. You've got 170mm of travel on the fork and the shock, so it's not super tall in its suspension. But ultimately, you know, you've still got a 19-inch front, which is bigger than a typical road bike, and it does weigh in at 246 kilograms fully fueled up. which is definitely on the slightly more hefty side. In fact, it's heavier than an R1300 GS. So yeah, there are always going to be some limitations in terms of handling, but I actually found it very fun to ride, predictable and steady through the corners, if not necessarily the sharpest turning bike. For me, I'd say the suspension feels slightly on the firm side, and both the Sachs upside down fork and the KYB monoshock are just preload and rebound adjustable, so you can't get the compression absolutely dialed into your taste. I do appreciate the remote preload adjuster on the shock, so you can make quick changes if you've got a luggage or a passenger, but I think at this sort of price point, especially with this top spec version, well, maybe it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity that it wasn't fitted with electronically adjustable semi-active suspension. In my opinion, it's a great feature that really suits adventure touring style bikes where it's meant to be a really versatile machine, and I think that would have helped it feel more comfortable when you're cruising along, but then also being able to maintain its composure when you do start riding quicker through corners and stuff. The thing that's really interesting as well is the S version of the Mandela Roadster, which is built upon the same platform. Well, that comes in about $1,000 cheaper than this bike, and yet it comes with Öhlins Smart EC2 suspension, and so yeah, I think it's just a bit of a shame that it wasn't carried over here. What you do get though on this rider assistance version, like I say, the top dog, you pay about 700 quid more than the base bike, is radars front and rear, which opens up some of the latest techie features. And I'm a bit mixed on this one because I like some stuff about it, but then also there is some stuff missing. The front gives you collision warnings or close follow warnings on the dash. They're really quite subtle, but I think perhaps a nice little nudge if you become a bit transfixed on the dash. And then also the rear radar gives you blind spot warnings with a little LED set into the mirror, but also a nice big amber block on the dash, which I think makes it more obvious, and you don't always see this on other bikes with blind spot warnings, so I think that was quite a smart little thought from Moto Guzzi. The thing that's missing though is the active cruise control, which was of course, a big selling point of this bike when it was first announced. What I hadn't quite appreciated is that it's actually an accessory further still versus this rider assistance top model. And weirdly, you don't be able to seem to spec it up on the website, so I'm not entirely sure it's available. It's certainly not on this press bike anyway, so I haven't been able to test it out. And I did a bit of research and read some reviews from the press launch of this bike. And again, it seems like none of the bikes there had it fitted either, and you can't find it on the website, so I'm not even sure it exists yet. In fact, I'd love to know from anyone who's bought a Stelvio this year whether you've managed to have the active cruise fitted at your dealer, so let me know down in the comments. But on to the price, and the standard bike will cost you $14,850, whereas this rider assistance version, like I say, 700 more at $15,550. For that sort of money, I've already mentioned the Africa Twin, the Tiger 900 Rally Pro is really well spec'd. And then you've also got some options that comes in lower in price, like the 890 Adventure from KTM. BMW's F900 GS looks like a good shout. There's the Desert X as well you could get for the same money. Or if you want something more road focused, you could think about a Multistrada V2, a Yamaha Tracer 9, or even you're getting quite close to BMW S1000 XR money. So there really are a lot of bikes to choose from, and it had me kind of wondering, well, what would make someone choose this? I think you've got to say though, it's a really great looking bike, and that's definitely going to be a big selling point, as is the authentic Italian DNA that you get with the Moto Guzzi badge. And it's just generally a really pleasant bike to ride, with the engine as a standout feature. I don't think it necessarily stands out in any one area in terms of the spec sheet, apart from maybe the shaft drive, but I just found it super addictive. I love the way that it felt, the liveliness at the top of the rev range, the brilliant soundtrack as well, and so it's one of those bikes that you sort of end your ride and you don't really want to get off. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below, and if the more road focused variant sounds like your cup of tea, then I'll leave my review of the V100 Mandela on the screen now, so you can give it a click if you haven't watched it already. Also, do hit subscribe if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news and reviews like this right here on MOTOBOB. And massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.